The rarest thing you can offer a person who has spent their whole life bracing for impact is the simple, revolutionary act of being exactly what you said you were. It is not grand gestures. It is not the relentless extension of patience that slowly wears down their walls through sheer endurance. It is not the performance of being low maintenance, the strategic withholding of needs designed to make yourself easier to love, the careful calibration of your emotional expression to a frequency the avoidant finds manageable. It is not the pursuit, however tender. It is not the understanding, however deep. It is not even the love itself, because the avoidant has received love before, has been offered warmth and consistency and genuine care by people who meant every bit of it, and has retreated from all of it with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom love, however real, has never quite been safe enough to fully receive. None of these things make the avoidant fall deeper. They may hold the avoidant in proximity. They may create the conditions for occasional closeness, but they do not reach the specific place inside the avoidant where the deepest falling happens, the place that has been locked not through indifference, but through a fear so old and so foundational that most people who try to love an avoidant never find it because they are looking for it in the wrong direction entirely. What reaches that place is something almost counterintuitively simple. And yet, it is the rarest thing in the avoidance relational world, rarer than patience, rarer than understanding, rarer than the kind of unconditional positive regard that therapists spend years learning to offer. It is so rare, in fact, that the avoidant has almost certainly never encountered it in the precise form that makes it transformative. Which is why, when they encounter it in you, the response it produces in them is so disproportionate to its apparent simplicity. The one thing that makes an avoidant fall 50 times deeper is the complete, unhesitating, entirely undisguised fullness of who you actually are, offered without apology, without performance, without the modification that most people apply to themselves in the early vulnerability of being close to someone they want to keep. It is your wholeness, unedited, unstrategized, entirely uncomplicatedly real. This requires unpacking because wholeness is a word that can slide past without landing with the weight it deserves. What wholeness means here is not perfection. It is not the curated presentation of your best qualities, carefully arranged to make the most compelling case for your worth. It is not even the admirable self-possession of someone who has done extensive internal work and arrived at a settled relationship with themselves, though that is part of it. Wholeness, in this context, means the specific quality of someone who has needs and does not pretend otherwise, who has opinions that do not soften themselves to accommodate the room, who has edges, emotional, intellectual, personal, that do not sand themselves down in the presence of someone whose approval they want, who can be hurt and say so, not as a demand for a particular response, but as a simple, honest statement of what is true for them, who can disagree with the avoidant directly, without hostility, without the anxiety of someone who believes that disagreement is the first step toward being abandoned, and remain entirely comfortable in the disagreement. It is the quality of someone who exists independently of the avoidant's perception of them, whose sense of self does not waver in the presence of the avoidant's withdrawal, whose interior life does not reorganize itself around the avoidant's moods, the avoidant's availability, the avoidant's temperature on any given day. A person who is, at all times and in all circumstances, recognizably and irreducibly themselves, regardless of whether the avoidant is leaning in or pulling back, regardless of whether the avoidant is warm or cold, present or distant, engaging or retreating. This person is extraordinarily rare in the avoidance world, and the avoidance response to encountering them goes far beyond attraction. It approaches something that, for many avoidants, is genuinely unprecedented. To understand why wholeness produces this response, the avoidant's relational history needs to be held in clear view. The avoidant has, across the course of their emotional life, encountered love in a specific and recurring configuration. The person who loves them wants something from them. Not in a mercenary sense, not anything as simple as resources or status, but emotionally. They want the avoidant's openness, their availability, the confirmation of being chosen, of being important, of mattering enough to the avoidant to produce a consistent, visible, reassuring demonstration of that mattering. This wanting, which is entirely understandable, which is in fact the ordinary wanting of anyone who has invested their emotional world in another person, creates a dynamic that the avoidant's nervous system experiences as pressure. The pressure of being someone's primary source of emotional security, the pressure of knowing that their distance causes pain, that their withdrawal has consequences, that another person's internal state is connected in some measurable way to their behavior. This pressure is not a small thing for the avoidant. It activates the precise fear that their attachment system was constructed to manage. The fear that being needed will lead to being unable to meet the need, which will lead to the loss of the connection, which will confirm the foundational belief that love is something they are not quite capable of sustaining. So the avoidant retreats from the wanting, not from the person, from the wanting, from the felt weight of being someone's something in a way that exposes both of them to the possibility of failure. Now consider what happens when the avoidant encounters someone whose wholeness means they do not carry that wanting in the same configuration. Not someone who does not want the avoidant, that would produce no falling at all, but someone who wants the avoidant without needing the avoidant, who is drawn toward them, engaged by them, genuinely interested in the full, complex reality of who they are, and simultaneously entirely self-contained, whose well-being does not hinge on the avoidant's behavior, whose sense of self does not contract when the avoidant retreats or expand when the avoidant engages, who is, in the most fundamental sense, already whole before the avoidant enters the equation. The pressure disappears, not because this person demands nothing. They have needs, they express them, they bring the full honesty of their emotional world to the connection, but because their needs are not a weight held over the avoidant. They are simply information, true things about a true person, offered without the implied obligation that the avoidant repair or manage or be responsible for the feelings those needs carry. And in the absence of the pressure, in the specific, unfamiliar spaciousness of a connection that does not demand that the avoidant be anything other than exactly what they are, something in the avoidant's nervous system does something it almost never does. It relaxes. The falling begins in that relaxation. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a sudden dramatic recognition of feeling. The avoidant does not do sudden dramatic recognitions of feeling, or not often, and not in the early stages of anything. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the accumulating experience of being with someone in whose presence the usual vigilance is not required. The avoidance vigilance, the constant low-level monitoring of the emotional weather of a connection for signs of the pressure they are always anticipating, always managing, always trying to stay one step ahead of, is exhausting in a way that the avoidant has almost certainly never named, even to themselves. It is such an old exhaustion, so woven into the fabric of how they exist in relationship, that they have come to experience it as simply the ordinary texture of closeness, the toll that intimacy exacts, the price of being in connection with another person, with you, with your wholeness, your independence, your settled refusal to make yourself smaller, or your needs quieter, or your personhood more accommodating. The monitoring finds nothing to manage. The weather is clear, not because nothing is happening emotionally. Everything is happening emotionally because you are present and real and fully engaged. But because what is happening does not require the avoidant to manage it. It simply exists, honestly, cleanly, without the distortion of need as pressure or love as obligation. In this unfamiliar clarity, the avoidant begins to notice you in a way that the vigilance usually prevents. Really notice the specific texture of your mind, the particular quality of your humor, the way you navigate difficulty, the things that move you and the things that don't, the edges and the depths and the contradictions of a full human being living an honest relationship with themselves. They notice you because they are not too busy managing the weight of the connection to actually experience the connection. And what they experience in the noticing is a person they cannot categorize, a person who does not fit the familiar architecture of every relationship their attachment system has navigated before, a person who is somehow genuinely present without being consuming, genuinely wanting without being needing, genuinely loving without making the love a condition, a test, a pressure applied to a tender place. This is new. Completely disorienting, quietly revolutionary new. The depth that accumulates from this newness is not ordinary attraction deepening through familiarity. It is something more specific and more significant. The avoidant begins to invest in a way that is different in quality from any investment they have made before, not the reluctant, partial, perpetually hedged investment of someone who is always maintaining an exit, always keeping a portion of themselves in reserve, always ensuring that if the connection ends, they will not have lost anything they cannot recover from. This investment has a quality of genuine risking, of actually putting something real into the connection, attention, care, the specific tenderness that arises for a person who has reached something in you that you did not know was reachable. The avoidant begins to want to know you. Not the performed version of you that most people bring to early connection, but the full version, the parts that are less immediately appealing, the history that carries its complications, the depths that require patience to reach. They begin to be curious about you in the way that people are curious about things that matter to them, not casually, not strategically, but with the genuine engagement of someone who has decided, perhaps without fully realizing the decision is being made, that you are worth understanding. And as the investment deepens, the falling deepens with it. 50 times is not hyperbole. It is an attempt to capture the qualitative difference between the shallow, self-protective, perpetually hedged engagement the avoidant offers in ordinary circumstances and the full, unguarded, genuinely vulnerable falling that your wholeness makes possible. The difference is not incremental. It is categorical. It is the difference between the avoidant existing in a connection and the avoidant being in one, entirely, consequentially, in the way that changes people. Your wholeness does something else that nothing else can do. It gives the avoidant permission to be whole too. Not immediately, not without resistance, not without the habitual retreat that will happen several times before it stops being the automatic response to the discomfort of genuine closeness, but gradually, in the accumulated experience of being with someone whose wholeness is not a demand but a demonstration, someone who shows, through the simple practice of being fully themselves, that fullness is survivable, that honesty is not catastrophic, that need expressed without ultimatum is simply human, the avoidant begins to believe that their own wholeness might be receivable, that their own complications, their own history, their own contradictions and fears, and the specific texture of their inner world might be something another person could know and stay for. Not despite the knowing, because of it. The way you stay for the knowing of them. This belief, fragile at first, tentative, frequently interrupted by the old fear that asserts itself regardless of evidence, is the most transformative thing the avoidant has ever been offered. Not love, not patience, not the relentless extension of grace to someone whose fear keeps making them unworthy of it. Permission. the permission to be real in the presence of someone who is real in a connection that does not require either of them to be less than the full, complicated, entirely human thing they actually are. The avoidant falls 50 times deeper, not because you loved them more than anyone else, but because you loved them differently, fully, from a place so grounded in your own wholeness that the love did not arrive as pressure or weight or the subtle, suffocating demand of someone whose security depends on theirs. It arrived as an invitation, open, unhurried, entirely without condition. And for someone who has spent their whole life managing the cost of closeness, an invitation with no hidden price is the most extraordinary thing in the world. It is the one thing that reaches past every wall, not because it dismantles them, because it makes the person inside them finally genuinely wonder what they have been protecting themselves from and whether the protection was ever worth what it cost them to keep it.